In the early 20th century, the world was plunged into chaos as the drums of war beat louder, drawing in millions of soldiers and civilians alike into the vortex of conflict. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked a turning point in human history, a moment when the industrial might of nations would be unleashed on an unprecedented scale. As the war raged on, the demand for military equipment, including watches and other timekeeping devices, skyrocketed. In the United States, the need for glow-in-the-dark watch faces became particularly pressing, as soldiers in the trenches required a reliable means of telling time in the dark. To meet this demand, factories across the country began to produce watches at an incredible pace, with hundreds of thousands of timepieces rolling off assembly lines every month. At the heart of this effort were the women who worked tirelessly to paint the watch faces with a special glow-in-the-dark paint containing radium, a highly radioactive element. These women, who would come to be known as the Radium Girls, were largely unaware of the dangers that lurked in the very substance they were working with. As they carefully crafted each watch face, they would often moisten their brushes with their tongues, thereby ingesting small amounts of radium daily. This seemingly innocuous action would have devastating consequences, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever change the lives of these women and the world they lived in. The Radium Girls were not just factory workers, they were also the faces of a new era of industrialization, one in which women played a crucial role in the war effort. As the United States mobilized for war, women were drawn into the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on jobs that had previously been the exclusive domain of men. The Radium Girls were thus part of a larger phenomenon, one that would reshape the social and economic landscape of America forever. As the demand for glow-in-the-dark watches continued to skyrocket, the women working with radium-laced paint found themselves at the forefront of a ticking time bomb. With each delicate stroke of their brushes, they were unwittingly exposing themselves to the dangers of radium poisoning. The substance, though highly effective at illuminating watch faces, was also a potent carcinogen, emitting ionizing radiation that would slowly but surely destroy the cells in their bodies. The effects of radium poisoning were insidious, manifesting initially as fatigue, anemia, and bone pain, before progressing to more severe symptoms, including necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would come to be known as radium jaw. This gruesome affliction, characterized by the disintegration of the jawbone, would leave its victims disfigured and in excruciating pain. As the Radium Girls continued to toil away in factories, their bodies were gradually accumulating a toxic load of radium, setting them on a collision course with a horrific fate. The risks associated with radium were well known to some scientists and medical professionals at the time, but these warnings fell on deaf ears, as the U.S. Radium Corporation and other manufacturers continued to prioritize profits over the safety of their employees. The consequences of this neglect would soon become all too apparent, as the Radium Girls began to fall ill, their bodies ravaged by the very substance they had worked with so diligently. It was not until the spring of 1917, when 5 former dial painters from the Orange, New Jersey factory of the United States Radium Corporation, filed a lawsuit against their former employer, that the tragic fate of the Radium Girls would finally begin to garner widespread attention. The women, all of whom had fallen ill with severe cases of radium poisoning, alleged that the company had knowingly endangered their lives, and that they had been deliberately misled about the risks associated with working with radium. The lawsuit, which was widely publicized in the press, marked a turning point in the struggle for justice and recognition for the Radium Girls, and it would ultimately play a pivotal role in shaping the course of labor law and workplace safety regulations in the United States. As the case progressed, it became clear that the U.S. Radium Corporation had engaged in a concerted effort to conceal the dangers of radium from its employees, going so far as to instruct factory supervisors to discourage workers from discussing their health problems with one another. The company had also allegedly pressured doctors to misdiagnose cases of radium poisoning, and to attribute the symptoms to other causes, such as syphilis or tuberculosis. The shocking revelations that emerged during the lawsuit would ultimately expose the dark underbelly of the radium industry, and would galvanize public opinion against the companies that had so callously exploited their employees. The shocking revelations that emerged during the lawsuit would ultimately expose the dark underbelly of the radium industry, and would galvanize public opinion against the companies that had so callously exploited their employees. As the case progressed, it became increasingly clear that the U.S. Radium Corporation's actions were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a broader pattern of negligence and deception that pervaded the entire industry. The company's use of radium, a highly toxic and radioactive substance, was widespread, and its effects were felt far beyond the factories where the women worked. The women's bodies, once luminous with the glow of radium, now told a different story, one of suffering, of pain, and of a desperate struggle for justice. The lawsuit would ultimately reveal that the U.S. Radium Corporation had been aware of the dangers of radium for years, and had chosen to ignore them in the pursuit of profit. The company's executives had been motivated by the promise of vast profits, and had shown a callous disregard for the lives of their employees. As the women's stories began to emerge, a disturbing picture began to take shape, one of a company that had prioritized its own interests above all else, and had left its employees to suffer the consequences. The women's bravery in the face of overwhelming odds would ultimately change the course of history, but the true extent of the damage had yet to be fully revealed. As the women's cases made their way through the courts, a critical examination of the radium industry's practices began to shed light on the root causes of their suffering. It became increasingly apparent that the very nature of the watch face painting process was inherently hazardous. The women, often using their tongues to shape the fine brushes used for the delicate work, had been ingesting small amounts of radium-laced paint on a daily basis. The cumulative effect of this exposure had led to severe health complications, including radiation poisoning, anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would come to be known as radium jaw. Moreover, the radium, once ingested, would accumulate in the women's bones, causing irreparable damage and rendering them radioactive for the rest of their lives. The lack of proper ventilation in the factories and the absence of protective gear had further exacerbated the problem, creating a toxic work environment that was all but guaranteed to produce devastating health consequences. As the true extent of the radium industry's negligence began to emerge, it became clear that the women's bravery in speaking out had sparked a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to a fundamental transformation in labor laws and worker safety regulations. The Radium Girls' fight for justice ultimately led to a seismic shift in the way workers were protected from occupational hazards. As their story gained widespread attention, labor unions, health organizations, and government agencies began to scrutinize the radium industry's practices, forcing companies to adopt safer manufacturing processes and provide adequate protective gear for their employees. The Radium Girls' courageous stand also spurred the development of more stringent regulations, including the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which has since become a cornerstone of worker protection in the United States. The women's determination to expose the truth about the radium industry's negligence has left a lasting legacy, one that extends far beyond the watch factories where they toiled in obscurity. Their struggle serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrial progress and the importance of safeguarding the well-being of those who labor behind the scenes to drive innovation forward. As we reflect on the Radium Girls' ordeal, we are reminded that even in the